Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 593. I'm the host of the show, Kyle Anzalone. We got a good amount of news to get through on today's show, a lot of important stuff, including talking about Lindsey Graham and some of the more ridiculous comments that he has maybe ever made. So be sure to share this show. Host it at the Libertarian Institute. We repost the show on the blog at antiwar.com. YouTube, Rumble, or Odysee for the video version of the show. And of course, it's up anywhere you could listen to audio podcasts. Follow me on Twitter at KyleAnslone_. I'm approaching 6,000 followers now, so we've added a lot of new followers on Twitter over the past month. Really appreciate all the new people following and sharing out the show. Really appreciate it if you could do that as well. And let's get into the news today. First up here is an article that I wrote for the Libertarian Institute on May 13th. Sweden is open to hosting NATO nuclear weapons. The Swedish Prime Minister says country would be willing to host nuclear weapons during a war. The North Atlantic Alliance has a nuclear sharing program that has U.S. nuclear weapons deployed to 5 countries. The Polish leader recently said he hopes Warsaw can one day join the program. So the Swedish Prime Minister said on Swedish public radio that Stockholm would be willing to host nuclear weapons during wartime. Quote, in a war situation, it's completely different matter. It would be entirely on what would happen. In the absolute worst case scenario, the democratic countries in our part of the world must ultimately be able to defend themselves against countries that could threaten us with nuclear weapons. So his remarks came as Sweden hosted the leaders of Germany, Denmark, Finland, Norway, and Iceland to discuss deepening military ties. This is a quote from the Danish Prime Minister. For decades, we have lived very peacefully without any very big threats to Europe. Personally, I think these times are over. With all that we see from the Russian side, we are at the beginning of a new era. It would be wrong if we as a government said that you don't have to deal with this in your everyday life. And so one thing that I want to point to here is that when the Swedish Prime Minister makes his comments that we would only look at this during wartime, well, if we're talking about Russia invading Sweden, that seems extremely unlikely, even Russia going to war with another NATO state, as long as the alliance doesn't admit Ukraine. Again, seems very unlikely. And so, maybe these comments are just bluster and we don't really have to worry about them. However, I think there is a very real possibility that NATO at some point, as Ukraine collapses, basically makes themselves a formal partner to the conflict in Ukraine. And, at that point in time, maybe NATO, Sweden decide that they are on a wartime footing and then start to go further down this road. So Sweden is the newest member of NATO. When Stockholm first requested NATO membership, Russian President Vladimir Putin said Russia would not object to the move unless more weapons were deployed to Swedish territory. This is a quote from Putin at the time. We do not have such problems with Sweden and Finland, which unfortunately we have with Ukraine. We have no territorial issues, no disputes. We have nothing that could bother us from the point of view of Finland or Sweden's membership in NATO. Only they should plainly and clearly realize that there were no threats before. Now, if military contingents and infrastructure are deployed there, we will have to respond in a mirror manner and create the same threats to the territories from which these threats are created to us. And so I think what Putin is explicitly warning there is like, look, if this is just a typical, NATO country, right? If they're just going to act as, say, any Germany or something like that, then that's not going to be a problem for Russia. It's going to be a problem for Russia if they launch a major military buildup in Sweden after they become a member, and certainly putting nuclear weapons there would be considered a major military buildup. So the alliance has 3 nuclear weapon states, that the U.S., UK, and France, and the U.S. stores nuclear weapons in 5 additional countries, that is Italy, Turkey, Germany, Belgium, and the Netherlands. President Duda expressed his willingness to make Poland the 6th country to host nuclear weapons. I must admit that when asked about hosting nuclear weapons, I declared our readiness. Recently, Russia has been relocating its nuclear weapons to Belarus. If our allies decide to deploy nuclear weapons as part of the nuclear sharing also on our territory to strengthen the NATO's eastern flank, we are ready for it. And so again, this is very provocative and very concerning that you had the Polish leader and him expressing it, I think, far more readily than the Swedish leader. So at the time, the Russian government spokesperson said the Kremlin would respond if NATO moved forward with Duda's proposal. The military will, of course, analyze the situation if such plans are implemented, and in any case, we will do everything necessary to take all the necessary retaliatory steps to guarantee our safety, Dmitry Peskov, the Kremlin spokesperson, explained. So the reason I included that Peskov quote is I think it's important to understand that Russia tends to act a little differently than the West, where if this was flipped and it was Russia talking about expanding its nuclear sharing program, then you're likely going to get reactions and responses from the West before it's actually implemented, where Russia says, look, if this is implemented, if they start to move forward with it, then we're going to react, but we're not going to react just to Western leaders' comments. So that's, good news. I guess they just react rhetorically, right? All right, next up here, Ukraine says EU plan to provide over $3 billion per year is almost nothing. So Ukrainian officials has said that a European Union plan to provide Kiev with up to 3 billion euros, that's $3.2 billion per year for military aid, amounts to almost nothing in the context of the war. The EU ambassadors agrees to use profits generated from frozen Russian central bank assets to purchase up to $3.2 billion worth of weapons for Ukraine annually, but the Ukrainian justice minister told Politico last Thursday that Ukraine needs hundreds of billions of dollars. So he said, if we're talking about the needs of Ukraine and the need of the war, military and non-military, 3 billion euros is actually almost nothing. We need hundreds of billions in order to win the war. It's a good first step. So this is why I kind of thought they wouldn't pursue this path, is because I don't think the Ukrainians are wrong in that it is a drop in the bucket of what they need. Now, it seems extremely ungrateful to make comments like this. I do understand that. I'm not necessarily saying that, we should give Ukraine more money. I certainly don't believe that. However, if you are saying that you're going to give Ukraine everything it needs to wage this war, well, the Ukrainians probably, and rightfully so, believe they need hundreds of billions of dollars every year to do that. I mean, they have less men than Russia, less trained men. They don't have, a country to prepare their army. They don't have their own military industrial base. Russia is wrecking the country's energy infrastructure. And so Ukraine is going to need a lot of assistance in order to continue to fight this war. This proxy war that's been waged by Washington through Ukraine on Russia, and $3 billion won't do very much. However, it does create likely some very serious problems. Now, if it is maybe just $3.2 billion and they only do this for 1 year, maybe it's not enough money that Russia makes serious claims to that money later on and really tries to recapture it and then sets up this, real political issue, right? Imagine if the Americans, we have $5 billion in frozen Russian assets in the U.S. Let's say the Biden administration decides to give that to Ukraine, right? Now, when the war ends, Russia says, okay, we want our $5 billion back, and that's important to ending this war. And Washington says, well, we already gave it to Ukraine and it's already spent. And so now Washington has to come up with $5 billion. And so they're going to have to take it from the taxpayer. Well, how politically stable or sustainable is it? Are the American people going to be willing to swallow it? Think of what's happened with Iran, where we've unfrozen the Iranian assets, and we still have across the political spectrum major freakouts and accusations that the government is giving our taxpayer dollars to Iran to commit terrorism and things like that. So I think the problem here is once you start taking the frozen Russian assets and seizing them and giving them to Ukraine, it's likely that one day way Russia is going to ask for them back, or there's going to have to be retaliatory steps taken on Moscow's side to recoup those losses in some way. And so, you're setting up a situation where it's going to be far, far harder to unwind this war, but you're making relatively no gains for Ukraine by doing this. So it seems like an absolutely stupid plan. All right, next up here, we're talking about the battlefield a little bit, not going well for Ukraine. Ukraine Kharkiv's commander gets replaced as Russian forces advance. This from Dave DeCamp, antiwar.com. Ukrainian media reported on Monday that Ukrainian general responsible for the northeastern city of Kharkiv and the oblast was fired on May 11th, one day after Russian forces launched a new offensive in the region that had significant success. So the general was replaced by another general, and the news came as the Ukrainian troops were speaking about the lack of defenses in Kharkiv. One commander of a Ukrainian special reconnaissance unit said there was no first line of defense. We saw it. The Russians just walked in. They just walked in without any minefield. Either it was an act of negligence or corruption. It wasn't a failure. It is beyond a betrayal, he said in a Facebook post. We could die and no one would hear the truth. According to the BBC, everyone knew Russia was likely planning an incursion in the region, as Ukrainian and Western intelligence showed that Russia was building up a force on the other side of the border with an estimated 30,000 troops. The Russian Defense Ministry said on Sunday that its forces captured 9 villages in Kharkiv on Friday, or since Friday. On Monday, Russia said its troops entered the largest village in the area, which is only about 3 miles from the Russian border. Ukrainian officials say they believe the purpose of the Russian offensive is to stretch Ukraine's defensive lines, which are already at risk of collapsing. The head of Ukraine's military intelligence told the New York Times that Ukraine was facing a critical situation. He said, all of our forces are either here or in Charas Yar, referring to a city in Donetsk. I've used everything we have. Unfortunately, we don't have anything else in the reserves. And so it's interesting if this general was maybe just a head on a pike. It doesn't seem like the Ukrainians maybe had a whole lot to establish their front lines in Kharkiv. And so maybe it wasn't an act of negligence or corruption. Sorry, that's the word I'm looking for there, but rather some kind of just failure to have the supplies they need to even establish those fortifications. All right, next up here, we're talking about the lunatic Lindsey Graham suggesting Israel should just nuke Gaza. So this Dave DeCamp, May 13th, antiwar.com. On Sunday, Senator Lindsey Graham, Republican from South Carolina, suggested Israel should drop nuclear weapons on Gaza and compared the Israeli onslaught to World War II in an appearance on NBC's Meet the Press. So Graham said, when we were faced with destruction as a nation after Pearl Harbor fighting the Germans and the Japanese, we decided to end the war by bombing Hiroshima and Nagasaki with nuclear weapons. Graham said, the hawkish senator justified the U.S. nuking of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which killed hundreds of thousands of Japanese civilians, calling it the right decision. Graham and other Republicans have been fuming at Biden for threatening to withhold heavy bombs for Israel if it launches major attacks on population centers in Rafah. When asked why it was okay for former President Ronald Reagan to leverage military aid to Israel during its war in Lebanon in the 1980s, but not for Biden okay to do it now, Graham again pivoted to World War II and basically just started screaming. It was a complete meltdown on his part. It's one of these things you notice that sometimes when people get challenged on, things that are very core to them, like for Lindsey Graham, the American narrative around World War II is a religion, right? This is what he uses to justify the bombing. Now, it would be like reading a story from the Bible and then using that to make your decision and apply it to the world today. That's how he looks at World War II. He says, okay, so Hiroshima and Nagasaki is a story for how you are justified in using overwhelming force against your opponents. Even if the World War II comparison makes absolutely no sense between Israel and Gaza and compared to World War II, everything that Lindsey Graham believes about the world and foreign policy is really through this mystical narrative of World War II that we're taught in public schools, where the Americans defeated the Nazis. The Soviets were there, but they just didn't like the Nazis for some reasons, but don't really consider or talk about the fact that they're really responsible for the defeat of the Nazis. And then and then when it comes to Japan, the firebombing of the cities, and the nuclear weapon usage, of course, we claim is meant to save the lives of not only Americans but Japanese too. We would have had to do this costly ground invasion. Millions of people would have died, but we used these two bombs, and sure, we killed well over 250,000 innocent civilians hitting non-military targets. However, it saved the lives of more people who would have died through an invasion. Oh, by the way, all that the Japanese were asking for was that point is to keep the emperor on the throne, and we allowed that to happen anyways. So apparently we didn't have to do an invasion or nuke Japan. We could have just taken the surrender that they were offering. So Israeli officials have repeatedly invoked the U.S. and allied strategic bombing campaigns to justify the destruction in Gaza, including Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. So, we see this too, where Netanyahu, a very, very savvy person who's willing to utilize religion to justify his military rampages. He tells his own soldiers that the enemy is Amalek, and to remember Amalek, which, is calling for the slaughter of the entirety of people in Gaza. And we've certainly seen that play out. Into Joe Biden, he cites, the American religion, World War II, and say, this is your history. This is what you do in response. And so this is what we need to do. Next up here, White House again denies that Israel is committing genocide in Gaza. So the White House on Monday again denied that Israel is committing genocide in Gaza despite the massive number of civilian casualties and the continued restriction on aid as Palestinians are facing starvation. This is White House National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan. We believe Israel can and must do more to ensure the protection and well-being of innocent civilians. We do not believe what is happening in Gaza is a genocide. We have been firmly on record rejecting that position. So the U.S. has rejected the ruling from the International Court of Justice that is plausible that Israel is committing a genocide in Gaza. If Israel is found guilty of genocide, it would implicate Sullivan and other U.S. officials, as they have provided military and political support to enable the slaughter. Sullivan said the U.S. was using the internationally accepted term for genocide, which includes focus on intent, to reach its assessment on Israeli actions. In its genocide case against Israel, South Africa cited comments from Israeli officials as evidence of Israel's intent to commit genocide against the Palestinians in Gaza. Notable quotes include Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant saying Israel was fighting human animals, and I would add to that his quote saying that they were not going to allow any food, fuel, and other aid into Gaza, and essentially, starve the people to death, dehydrate the people to death. And we see that's going on now, is essentially Israel has essentially blockaded the strip. So the genocidal rhetoric hasn't stopped, as Israeli Finance Minister Smotrich recently made a reference to Amalek just last month when he called for the total annihilation of Rafah and other cities in Gaza. He said, "There are no half measures. Rafah and other cities, total annihilation. You will blot out the remembrance of Amalek from under heaven," he said. All right. So next here is an article from CNN that I took some quotes from and put them on Twitter. CNN speaks with Israeli whistleblowers about abuse of detained Palestinians. So CNN reports, at a military base that now doubles as a detention center in Israel's Negev desert, an Israeli working at the facility snapped 2 photographs of the scene that he says continue to haunt them. Rows of men in gray tracksuits are seen on paper-thin mattresses, ring-fenced by barbed wire. All appear blindfolded, their heads hanging heavy under the glare of floodlights, a putrid stench in the air, and the room haunted with men's murmurs. The Israeli who was at the facility told CNN the men are forbidden from speaking to each other, so the detainees mumble to themselves. We were told they were not allowed to move. They should sit upright. They are not allowed to talk. They are not allowed to peek under the blindfold. According to the accounts, the facility, some 18 miles from Gaza frontier, is splintered into two parts, which encloses around 70 Palestinian detainees from Gaza, are placed under extreme physical restraint, and a field hospital where wounded detainees are strapped to their beds, wearing diapers, and fed through straws. They are stripped down of anything that resembles human beings, said one whistleblower who worked at a medic at the faculty's field hospital. The beatings were not done to gather intelligence. They were done out of revenge, said another whistleblower. It was punishment for what they, the Palestinians, did on October 7th, and punishment for the behavior in the camp. Responding to CNN's request for comment on allegations made in this report, the Israeli military, known as the IDF, said in a statement, the IDF ensures proper conduct towards the detainees in custody. Any allegation of misconduct by IDF soldiers is examined and dealt with accordingly. Inappropriate cases, military police criminal investigation division. Investigations are opened when there is suspicion of misconduct justifying such action. Detainees are handcuffed based on their risk level and health status. Incidents of unlawful handcuffing are not known to authorities. CNN spoke with 3 Israeli whistleblowers who worked at the Seed Teman desert camp, which holds Palestinians detained during Israel's invasion of Gaza. All spoke out at risk of legal repercussions and reprisals from groups supportive of Israel's hardline positions in Gaza. They paint a picture of a facility where doctors sometimes amputated prisoners' limbs due to injuries sustained from constant handcuffing of medical procedures, sometimes performed by underqualified medics, earning a reputation as a paradise for interns, and where the air is filled with the smell of neglected wounds that have been left to rot. Guards were instructed to scream, "Shut up," but the Arabic translation of that, and were told to pick out people who are problematic and punish them. The IDF did not directly deny accounts of people being stripped of their clothes and held in diapers. Instead, the Israeli military said that the detainees were giving back their clothing once the IDF determined they posed no security risk. The article goes on. It gets darker in some places. It's absolutely horrific. It lines up very well with the reports that we've talked about from Haaretz, 972 magazine, the UN, other international aid organizations and bodies, human rights groups who have come out and said that Israel is doing this to the detainees. Now, one thing that I found so striking here, right, is in the West, we're often propagandized against China, and certainly the Chinese government is repressive to the people in Xinjiang, the Uyghurs living there. Now, I'm not quite sure that amounts to genocide or anything that is nearing that, but still they're mistreated. And if you remember, not that long ago, a pretty famous right-winger, Jordan Peterson, posted a video that was actually a part of a pornography, but basically alleged torture in a dungeon, men strapped to a bed and things like that. The scene is actually somewhat reminiscent of what the Israelis are doing to these Palestinians. And, one is going to get, again, the whole right wing declaring that we have to, take aggressive action against China because they're committing a genocide. And the other one gets almost no reaction at all from the West, even though, again, one was a video from a pornographic film that Jordan Peterson just reposted because he's cartoonishly stupid. And the other one is an actual photo obtained from an Israeli torture prison, and it's just so horrific. Also, I mean, so much of the photos coming out here remind you of Abu Ghraib and the photos from Gitmo, and I guess from my point of view, it seems that is one of, if not the worst mistake America made during the work on terror was having those torture programs, how many people were really radicalized. And I don't mean the worst mistake in that it killed the most innocent people, obviously. There are really awful bombing campaigns that the U.S. has carried out over the years. But as far as it goes, you know, I think just propagandizing people to hate Americans and fueling the terror war against America, it's hard to see anything other than those torture camps that had so much impact. All right, next up here, U.S. Army officer resigns over unqualified support for Israeli slaughter in Gaza. And, you know, given what we just talked about, it's kind of hard not to think that this guy is right. So an Army officer working at the Pentagon Defense Intelligence Agency has resigned his post of the U.S. over the U.S.'s unqualified support for the Israeli slaughter of Palestinians in Gaza. So this is Major Harrison Mann, and he posted his resignation letter on LinkedIn and said it was initially distributed within the DIA on April 16th. In the letter, he said the DIA does not only inform policy but facilitates and at times directly executes policy, referring to the U.S. support for Israel. The policy has never been far away from my mind for the past 6 months, is nearly unqualified for the support of the government of Israel, which has enabled the empowerment and the killing and the starvation of tens of thousands of innocent Palestinians. As we were recently reminded, this unconditional support also encourages restless escalation and risks wider war, Mann said in his resignation letter. He added that his work at the DIA had been unquestionably contributed to support for Israel and that the horrific and heartbreaking images coming from Gaza caused him great shame. Mann submitted his resignation letter on November 1st, but according to the New York Times, it is unclear of when he officially separated from the DIA. Mann said in the letter that he tried to continue to working his job and hoped that at some point the slaughter would come to an end or that President Biden would alter his policy of unconditional support. However, at some point, whatever the justification, you're either advancing policy that enables the mass starvation of children or you're not, he wrote. Mann pointed to his Jewish heritage as one of the reasons for resigning and speaking out. He wrote, and I want to clarify that as a descendant of European Jews, I was raised in a particularly unforgiving moral environment when it came to the topic of bearing responsibility for ethnic cleansing. My grandfather refused to ever purchase products manufactured in Germany, where the paramount importance of never again and the inadequacy of just following orders was often repeated. He wrote, and he continues here, I am haunted by the knowledge that I have failed in those principles, but I have also hope for that my grandfather would afford me some grace, that he would still be proud of me for stepping away from this war, however belatedly, he wrote. In a post on LinkedIn that was written on Monday, Mann said that he received an unexpected outpouring of support after he distributed the letter internally. He said that he was sharing the letter publicly to show his colleagues that they are not alone if they feel oppressed to what they are supporting in Gaza. If they feel opposed to what they are supporting in Gaza. He said, it is clear that this week, some of you will be asked to provide support directly or indirectly to the Israeli military as it conducts operations in Rafah and elsewhere in Gaza. I am sharing it right now in the hopes that you will discover that you are not alone, you are not voiceless, and you are not powerless. And it's quite amazing to see these resignations start to pile up and who they're coming from and how little coverage and attention they get in the mainstream media and on cable media. You know, during the Trump administration, we had some resignations and it was always made out to be about the biggest deal you can imagine. And here, you know, you have people resigning and very clearly articulating, you know, their reason for resigning and everything like that. And again, just not getting a whole lot of media attention to the point that it seems there are a lot of government employees who dissent and don't realize how much of a consensus that they have. All right, next up here, article from Brian Grimm at The Intercept. American medical missions trapped in Gaza facing death by dehydration as population clings to life. So Grimm writes here, upwards of 20 American doctors are trapped in Gaza as a result of Israel's post-invasion closure of the Rafah border crossing into Egypt, according to sources with knowledge of the plight of two ill-fated medical missions. Israel has blocked fuel, food, and water from entering Rafah for over a week, leading to severe dehydration among the general population, as well as doctors on the mission. Relatives of the doctors were told by the State Department that rescue efforts were underway, including through coordination with the United Nations and the IDF. Yet on Monday, the Israeli military fired on a United Nations vehicle that was traveling to the European hospital in Khan Yunis near Rafah, killing a UN employee and injuring another. A family member of one of the doctors stranded at the European hospital said that he suspected the vehicle was a part of the rescue mission but was uncertain. We are aware that the car is similarly supposed to be their rescue passage was shot at and a UN employee was killed and injured. We fear for their ability to have safe passage and exit. We are aware that there is active shelling around the hospital and that the staff have been told to stay away from the windows. Now think about this. There are American doctors trapped in these hospitals, right? And the Israeli military solution isn't to have a big PR stunt where they help get these doctors to safety and they, pat the doctors on the back and, celebrate the doctors and everything like that, right? That's not what Israel's doing. They're trapping the doctors there. Why? I think there's two reasons. One, they know the US media isn't going to make a big deal out of this. If these are American doctors trapped behind Russian lines, I'm sure Lindsey Graham, Tom Cotton, and other American politicians, maybe even people within the White House, would be talking about arranging some kind of rescue mission using American soldiers, potentially provoking a war against Russia to rescue the doctors. Here, it's the in Palestine, and we're barely putting pressure on our allies to help get these doctors out. And I think the other reason of what Israel is trying to do here is they want to make it so dangerous to provide support to Palestinians that it decreases the number of people willing to go into Gaza, particularly doctors. So among the stranded doctors is Adam Hamaway, a plastic surgeon, Army veteran from New Jersey. While serving in Iraq, he was on duty when now Senator Tammy Duckworth's mangled body was brought to the hospital after a helicopter was shot down. She credits him with saving her life. Hamaway's friend, Sami Shaban, has been in touch with him the past several days and said that he is physically doing well. He's a tough dude. Saban, who has lost 35 members of his own family in Gaza, said, "Now we just need to get him home. We funded the bombing of every single hospital there. You have to at least let the relief people in and out." The doctors are rationing water, and at least one physician is in poor health and on IV drip to combat dehydration. The dire state of the medical mission underscores how difficult the conditions are for the average Palestinian who has spent 7 months enduring the Israeli siege, whereas the medical missions arrived only recently. More than 1 million Palestinians are trapped in Rafah, which is the southernmost end of the Gaza Strip, and as Israel threatens a full-scale invasion of Rafah, Israeli troops entered the area last week and took over the crossing with Egypt. The doctors are part of two medical missions, one of which was organized by FAJR Scientific, which did not immediately respond to requests from comment. It was not immediately clear which organization set up the second mission. All right. Now, on the death toll here, there was a comment made by Joe Scarborough about how the UN has cut the number of dead Palestinians in half. And we could talk about Joe's lack of ability to do math here, but that also was just incorrect. So on Monday, the UN said the number of Palestinians killed by Israel in Gaza since October 7th hasn't changed, a figure that has surpassed 35,000. A UN spokesperson made the clarification after the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, OCHA, published figures from Gaza's health ministry that showed the number of Palestinians who have been killed and fully identified as of April 30th, which is about 25,000. And that is about 10,000 less than the 35,000 of total fatalities. Out of the 24,686 fully identified Palestinians, 7,797 were children, 4,959 were women, 1,924 were elderly, and 10,000 were men. The figures were published by OCHA on April 8th. 2 days earlier, the OCHA published figures that estimated from Gaza's media office that said that 35,000 Palestinians had been killed, including over 14,500 children and 9,500 women. This discrepancy led to claims that the UN halved the number of women and children killed in Gaza, but the official clarified that the overall death toll hasn't changed and that the latest numbers didn't take into account the roughly 10,000 dead Palestinians who haven't been fully identified. There are about another 10,000 plus bodies who still haven't been fully identified, and so the details of those which are children, which are women, that will be reestablished once full identification process is complete. And so, they're saying that, yeah, we have the dead bodies, so we know that these are dead Palestinians. We just don't know the names of them, probably because Israel wiped out the entire family, and it's really hard to identify a body if you've killed all the relatives. So, absolutely disgusting there. All right, this one from Jason Dids, May 9th, antiwar.com. Israeli drone strike kills 4 Hezbollah members in South Lebanon. Israel continued its attacks on southern Lebanon today, targeting vehicle traveling in southern Lebanon with a drone, killing 4 members of Hezbollah. The drone attack started a fire, which locals are struggling to extinguish. Hezbollah issued a statement confirming the deaths of 3 of its fighters. Israel declined to comment per usual, saying they do not comment on reports of military actions originating from foreign media. All right, next up here is a story on Syria. Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com wrote on May 9th, Israeli strikes were launched in Syria early Thursday morning, targeting a building on the outskirts of the Syrian capital of Damascus, Syria Sana news agency reported. At approximately 3:20 a.m. on Thursday, the Israeli enemy launched an aerial attack from the direction of the occupied Syrian Golan, targeting buildings in the Damascus countryside. The source added that there was some material damage, but no casualties were reported. The attack marks the second round of Israeli strikes on Syria this month. And so remember, Israel was striking Syria fairly recently, regularly, more than once a week at times, for quite a while. And then on April 1st, of course, they took out some Iranian officials at an Iranian diplomatic building, sovereign Iranian soil in the Syrian capital of Damascus. And it seems like Israel is more starting to ramp up its strikes since then. All right, next up here, one on Yemen from Jason Dids. 10 killed in clashes between Saudi-backed forces and Houthis in central Yemen. So an hour of heavy fighting in the Mareb government south of the city of Mareb has left at least 10 fighters dead and another 9 wounded as pro-Saudi government-backed fighters clash with the Houthi movement. Mareb is a valuable city because of its oil and gas resources, and it provides a route to the oil-rich Shuaba, an area it is speculated the Houthis are keen to take. Should they succeed, this would split South Yemen into 2. With the Saudi military intervention in 2015, pro-government forces took the southern city of Aden and tried to bull through Mareb towards the capital city of Sana'a. Since then, Mareb has been contested more or less consistently. Now, the fighting has been turned down for several years in Yemen, and so this could just be a blip. It does happen during times of ceasefire that a little bit of fighting breaks out. It could signal that larger operations are yet to come, and that, maybe a part of what the U.S. is trying to do in the Middle East now is draw Saudi Arabia back into its war in Yemen to fight against the Houthis, to try to, I guess, distract or keep the Houthis from targeting ships in the Red Sea. All right, last story here today. This one from Will Porter, May 10th, antiwar.com. U.S. orders troops to leave Niger. So the Pentagon has ordered more than 1,000 U.S. soldiers to leave Niger and deploy to other countries in the region, Politico reported. Talks with local officials are ongoing, however, and the Joe Biden administration hopes to reserve the drawdown before a final timeline is set. Reverse the drawdown before a timeline is set. The withdrawal is planned over the next several months and will see U.S. forces stationed elsewhere in Africa, an unnamed official told the outlet. However, they stressed the exact timeline could still change or even be reversed as negotiations in both Congress and with the Nigerian military junta are ongoing. The Defense Department first announced plans for a drawdown late last month, saying officials were holding discussions on an orderly and responsible withdrawal of U.S. forces that followed a decision by Niger to rescind a prior military deal with the U.S. in March, suspending security cooperation with the Pentagon. Niger has been ruled by military authorities since last July, when President Bazoum was ousted, and so the new government, known as the National Council for the Safeguard of the Homeland, the post-coup state, also moved quickly to expel some 1,500 French troops, and they completed their withdrawal in December. So hopefully this happens. We'll see. There's important drone bases in Niger, so I think the Americans are really looking to stay. As I have said, as the U.S. has indicated that they may be willing to leave Niger, if I were in that country, I would be holding my breath till every American is out of that country, because I think that the Biden administration would be willing to try a coup even to maintain their hold in West Africa. All right, everybody, that's the show for today. Thank you all so much for tuning in. Back with more later in the week.